Okay, I lost track of time there once again. So let's finish up here with the esophageal phase. The esophageal phase is just the last phase of swallowing where the bolus of food goes past the larynx and slides down the esophagus. And so during this phase, this is where we start feeling any potential peristalsis, moving the bolus of food down through the esophagus, where it will then interact with a sphincter, which we'll get to in a little bit, and the bolus of food will enter the stomach. So the esophagus, what is that? It's a big muscular tube. It's hollow, obviously, and it moves food from the mouth and liquids to the stomach. It is posterior to the trachea. It's behind the trachea. When it's empty, it's flat, and it opens up as food or liquid passes through it. It does enter the peritoneal cavity through an opening in the diaphragm. This is called the esophageal hiatus. So this hole is actually, pretty small, and the esophagus has a very tight junction with the hiatus. And so at this point, this is where, you're going to have the separation between the thoracic and the abdominal cavities. The esophagus itself is about 1 foot long, not very long, and it's about 2 centimeters in diameter, so you have to be careful how big a bolus of food you swallow. The wall is extremely muscular. There's a lot of mucosa there, a lot of submucosa, and a very thick muscularis layer, which makes sense. There's a lot of mucus in there to keep things flowing along smoothly, submucosa to help keep everything connected together. There is no serosal layer here, though, so there's no adventiva. The connective tissue, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. There's no serosal layer. Instead, there is a adventiva, which is a series of connective tissue fibers that holds the esophagus to the dorsal part of the body wall. And what is dorsal again? Remember, dorsal is posterior. Remember the dorsal fin of a shark? It's our posterior part of our body. So the stomach moving down, basically what the stomach's going to do is it's going to store ingested food, and it's going to allow a few things to happen. First, it's going to be a region where there's mechanical breakdown of food. There's also chemical digestion of some food. We do have lipase in here. There's a version of lipase. And there is a protein enzyme called pepsin in here. So remember, lipase digests lipids and fats, and pepsin digests protein. So the stomach is the first spot where protein digestion starts. And so you have a situation here where you have chemical digestion of fats and proteins, but very little digestion here of carbohydrates. Mechanical breakdown of food here is all due to chemical digestion and, to some degree, a little bit of the churning of the stomach. When the stomach is undergoing those mild peristalsis, what's happening is you have a mixing of the gastric juices. Gastric juices are going to include things like bile, mucus, other compounds, and that all gets mixed to make what we call chyme. So chyme is the stuff that's inside of your stomach before it gets down to the duodenum, the primary portion of the small intestine. Another thing to bear in mind, another function of the stomach, is to kill bacteria. So the stomach pH is extremely low. In fact, I was going to bring that up on the last slide, but the stomach pH is low. It is about 1.0, or it can be even as low as 0.5. Okay, that is very acidic, and the purpose of that is to kill bacteria. So over here in this picture, what we're seeing is the esophagus emptying into the stomach. The top of the stomach is called the fundus. The middle part is the body, and the bottom is the pylorus. Right here is the hepatoduodenal ligament, right there. And over here is the hepatogastric ligament holding the stomach and the liver together. So basically, the stomach is like what they say is like an inverted J, a backward J. And typically, you're going to find it between T7 and L3, depending on how tall the person is. The lesser curvature is the medial surface. The greater curvature, so here's the medial surface, This is the greater curvature on the outside here. This is the lateral surface. And inside, there are lots of little folds called rugae. We'll see a picture of that in a few minutes. Those folds are not the same thing as microvilli or villi. The folds are made up of a mucosal layer, and it allows the stomach to expand after you eat, say, for example, that Thanksgiving meal. There are 4 regions: the cardia, the fundus, the body, and the pylorus. I already showed you the fundus. The cardia is this first initial region that food and liquid enters into the stomach. All right. Cardia is near the heart, which is why it's called the cardia, and so the esophageal lumen opens into this into the cardial region via the cardial orifice, the cardial hole, right? The fundus we talked about, the body, the largest part of the stomach, and then the pylorus is made up of both the pyloric canal, which is connected to the duodenum. So the pyloric canal is where the emptying happens, and then this pyloric sphincter. Remember I mentioned that we were going to talk about sphincters? The pyloric sphincter is a round muscle that controls the release of the chyme, which is, the churned up food with digestive enzymes and bile, into the duodenum. So you're going to have the stomach. Let's go back one slide. You'll have the stomach right here. Right around here, you're going to find the pyloric sphincter. And so the pylorus is the transition between the base of the stomach, the terminal end, I guess you would say, and the top part of the duodenum, which is the first section or the first segment of the small intestine. If you look at the histology or the tissue slide of a stomach, you'll see a lot of columnar epithelium. That's going to be making lots and lots of mucus. That mucus is made by a specific set of cells called chief cells, and the mucus covers the entire surface of the stomach, and that's meant to protect it against the strong acid and the enzymes that you find inside of the stomach. So it's one of the ways that the stomach protects itself, just lots of mucus. This is where mucus is good, you guys. The gastric pits themselves open onto the gastric surface, which basically is the lumen, or the inside of the stomach. Whenever you hear the word lumen, it's the inside of something. So those mucus cells are going to be always dividing, always replacing themselves, because they're always being shed into the lumen of the stomach, into the chyme. So we're always kind of self-digesting to some degree. And so if stomach acid or the enzymes get deep into the mucosal layer, then the person might end up with ulcers. And in that particular case, that could be really damaging and dangerous to the person. So when we look here at a few diagrams of the stomach, what you're going to see is a cutaway here where you'll see all these little zigzags. Those are the rugae inside the stomach. That's what allows your stomach to stretch. And so right here, you can see these little rugae. And again, this is to allow expansion of the stomach when you eat a large meal. Expansion and absorption of water and things like that. You'll see right here the different layers. Here's the serosa down here. Remember, connective tissue, vasculature, a longitudinal muscle layer. So here's the muscularis, longitudinal and circular. There's some oblique muscle here as well. Here's the submucosa over here. The submucosa is adjacent to the mucosal layer, and this is where you're going to find lots and lots of individual cells that are adjacent to vasculature. And later on, you'll see that we're going to eventually find some lymphatic lacteals in this types of tissue, farther down the line, though, in the small intestine. When you look at an individual gastric pit, which is what you have right here, okay, I'm trying to identify a gastric pit. These gastric pits are made up of lots and lots of individual cuboidal epithelial cells, which I'm outlining here. The neck of the pit is right here, and then you have these two branches of the pit. Here's one branch here. There's another branch right here. The parietal cells here inside the pit are going to be making compounds that you'll learn about in physiology. Chief cells also making other compounds. The G cells here are called germinal cells. These are the stem cells that are going to be kicking off more epithelial cells that will migrate up into the tissue. And then we have smooth muscle cells over here in the submucosal layer. So the gastric pit's super important for making gastric juices. Lots of it. 1,500 mils a day, right? That's a lot. So the gastric pits are basically glands that go way down into what we call the lamina propria. Let's go back one slide again. Right here's the lamina propria, which is just basically connective tissue, the yellow stuff in there. They're branching tubular glands, and they make lots and lots of things called, well, first of all, the chief cells make the hydrochloric acid. Did I say that chief cells made mucus? If I said that before, I meant to say goblet cells, because remember, goblets fill with mucus in your stomach. The chief cells make hydrochloric acid. I think I said that by mistake, so if I did say that, check your notes right now. Parietal cells also make something called intrinsic factor, and this helps us absorb our vitamin B12. When there's dysfunction with parietal cells, sometimes we have a problem absorbing our B vitamins. So there are other ways to absorb your B vitamins, but you'll learn about that in physiology. The hydrochloric acid, like I mentioned, lowers the pH. That's what brings our pH to about 1 in our stomach, and it kills bacteria and protists and things that we might swallow with our sushi, right? But it also activates chief cell secretion. So one of the things that happens sometimes is that when somebody eats something very acidic, the chief cells may kick in additional acidic production, and then somebody will get a stomach ache. Chief cells also make something called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen also has a very, pepsinogen, it works in a very, very low pH environment, and pepsinogen is what gets turned into pepsin. So you have pepsinogen, which is kind of what you'd call like pre-pepsin. It is inactive pepsin. Plus hydrochloric acid, that's when you end up with active pepsin. I wish I could talk about this more because that is such a fun thing in physiology, but you'll get that in physiology. Now we're going to start with the small intestine, and I'm going to try to wrap this up in a couple minutes. Basically, the purpose of the small intestine is to digest food and absorb the nutrients. We have about 20 feet of this, and there are 3 major regions. The duodenum, which is the first few inches just past the stomach. The jejunum, which is the majority of it. Okay, this is where you have lots of digestion and absorbing happening. And the ileum, the last 12 inches. The ileum is what comes into contact with the large intestine and the appendix. Plica circularis, again, you're going to find more little plical folds along the length. In this particular case, the plica don't flatten as the intestine itself, and the plica help maintain, the rounded anatomy of the intestine. It allows the intestine not to flatten. It also expands surface area. So if we come over here, here is a plica circularis. On top of the plica are all the little microvilli. The little microvilli is where in the mucosa is where you're going to find absorption happening. So if we look over here, so here's the intestinal villi, here's an intestinal crypt right here. Within the crypts, you're going to find intestinal glands. Within these glands, deep down, you're going to have lymphatic vessels. Remember I mentioned you'd be seeing that. We have in the submucosa, we have vasculature. We have our smooth muscle, circular, and other layers of muscular tissue. And then down in the serosa, we have longitudinal muscle. Now, when we look over here at an individual villi, each individual villus has individual small columnar cells. Each cell has, and I'm trying to draw them out, little tiny hairs on the surface. And that is to allow for the absorption of nutrients across the epithelial layer. This is very important. When you have individual cells, and I'm not going to draw the little hairs on the surface, okay? So this is supposed to represent the cells along the length of the villi. This is going to be our blood, okay? When we absorb nutrients, we absorb through the cell, transcellularly. The reason why that's important is because the cells control what goes across. So if we need to absorb a certain type of protein, that protein will have a transporter that takes it across the cell, releases it from the cell into the bloodstream. If we have a problem and things go between the cells, then that's an uncontrolled absorption step, and that's very dangerous. You'll end up developing allergies. All right, we're going to have another video coming in just a minute.